There is a memory Brian carried for years after everything fell apart. A Tuesday evening, ordinary in every way, when Claire had laughed at something on her phone and said, almost to herself, "You'd never do that, would you?" He had smiled and said no, without even asking what she meant. He thought it was a small moment. He thought it didn't matter. It was only later, much later, that he understood she hadn't been making conversation. She had been asking a question she already believed she knew the answer to, and the answer frightened her. This is the story of Brian Calloway and his wife Claire Calloway. They had been married for 6 years when the quiet unraveling began. From the outside, their marriage looked steady. A shared apartment in a mid-sized city, 2 incomes, dinners on weeknights, weekend routines that had softened into something comfortable and reliable. But comfort, as anyone who has lived inside a long relationship knows, can carry its own kind of danger. It can feel so much like security that neither person notices when it starts to harden into distance. Brian loved Claire. That was never in question. But loving someone and truly seeing them are two different things. And somewhere in the middle years of their marriage, they had both stopped looking. What unraveled between them didn't begin with betrayal. It began with doubt. And the particular cruelty of doubt is that it doesn't need evidence. It only needs silence. Brian Calloway was the kind of man who kept his feelings organized, not suppressed, organized. He believed that if he managed life carefully enough, the difficult things would sort themselves out. He was 34, worked as a project coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who rarely raised his voice because he rarely felt the need to. He made lists. He kept his word. He remembered dates, their anniversary, her mother's birthday, the day they adopted their cat, a gray tabby named Otis who had become, without ceremony, the emotional center of their household. Claire was different in the ways that had once felt like balance. She was warmer in public and quieter at home. She had a wide social circle, friends from university, colleagues she met for drinks on Fridays, an energy that pulled people toward her in rooms. She worked in marketing and was good at it, which meant she understood instinctively how people wanted to be seen. Brian had always admired that about her. Sometimes lately, he wasn't sure if he was admiring it or feeling slightly outside of it. Their mornings were easy, coffee, the news, Otis circling between their feet. Their evenings were comfortable, dinner, a show, the familiar choreography of two people who know each other's rhythms so well, they no longer have to speak every thought aloud. That soundlessness had once felt like intimacy. These days, it occasionally felt like two people existing in parallel rather than together. But Brian told himself that was normal, that every marriage moved through quieter seasons. He believed that mostly. It was around this time that Claire's friend Diane began appearing more regularly in their life. Not physically. Diane lived across the city, but in conversation. Claire mentioned her often. Diane said this. Diane thinks that they'd grown closer recently, Claire explained, reconnecting after years of loose contact. Brian had met Diane a handful of times at group gatherings. She was vivid and self-assured with the kind of directness that could read as either refreshing or aggressive depending on the day. He had no real opinion of her. She was Claire's friend. That was the extent of it. One evening, they were lying in bed, each reading, when Claire put her book down and looked at the ceiling. "Do you ever feel like we've gotten too comfortable?" she asked. Brian lowered his book. "Comfortable how? Like, I don't know. Like we just assume things about each other." He thought about it. "Isn't that what happens after 6 years?" She turned her head toward him. Not quite looking at him. More like looking past him, at some version of him she was testing against a question she hadn't said yet. "Yeah," she said. "I suppose." She picked up her book again. Brian watched her for a moment, then returned to his own pages. He told himself it was nothing. A passing thought, the kind of thing people say when the day has been long and the mind wanders. But something small and quiet had shifted in the room, and he felt it without being able to name it. It started with a message request on his personal Instagram account. He almost didn't notice it. He used the app infrequently, mostly to follow a few photography accounts and occasionally post something Otis had done that deserved documentation. The request was from a profile he didn't recognize. The name was Nadia. The profile photo showed a woman in her early 30s, smiling in a way that suggested she knew how to present herself well. 3 photos total, account created 4 months ago. He accepted the request without thinking much of it. He had a habit of accepting connections from people who followed accounts he also followed. It felt harmless. The first message was casual. "Hey, you don't know me, but I think we have a few mutual friends. I came across your profile and I just wanted to say your cat is genuinely the most perfect animal I've ever seen." Brian laughed quietly to himself. He wrote back, "Otis appreciates that. He already knows he's perfect, so this will only make him worse." She replied quickly. The conversation was light, friendly. She asked what he did, where he lived broadly, whether he'd always been in the city. He answered without thinking much about it. It felt like the low-stakes, small talk of strangers online. But over the following week, the messages continued, and they shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. The way a path curves gradually without you noticing, you're no longer walking in a straight line. Her messages became warmer, more personal. She asked questions that gestured toward intimacy without quite crossing a line. What did he do when he needed to clear his head? What kind of music helped him think? Was he the kind of person who talked about his feelings or kept them inside? Brian started to feel something he couldn't immediately identify. Not flattery, exactly. Not discomfort, exactly. Something in between. A low alertness, at whom meanwhile Claire seemed both present and somehow unreachable. She would be there, physically, reliably. But there was a new guardedness in her, a careful quality in the way she looked at him sometimes, as though she was measuring something. He mentioned once that he'd been tired lately, that work had been relentless, and she nodded and said she understood, but her eyes held something other than understanding. Something watchful. One evening he asked, gently, if everything was all right between them. She said yes. Then, after a pause, she said, "Why do you ask? You seem like something's on your mind." "I'm fine," she said. "I'm just thinking." He waited for her to say more. She didn't. And he understood, in the way long-married people understand things without words, that she had made a decision not to tell him what she was thinking. He didn't push. He thought about that later. He wondered if he should have pushed. The next morning, Nadia's message read, "Can I be honest with you? I haven't talked to someone like this in a while. There's something about you that feels different." Brian read it twice. Then he set his phone down and sat very still for a moment. He thought about Diane's name appearing so often in Claire's conversations lately. He thought about Claire's watchful eyes. He thought about the Tuesday evening months ago when Claire had laughed at her phone and said, "You'd never do that, would you?" And something clicked into focus. He didn't have proof of anything, but he had the feeling of a man who has just recognized a shape in the fog. Not because he can see it clearly, but because something in him already knew it was there. Brian didn't go looking for confirmation in an aggressive way. He wasn't that kind of man. Instead, he did something quieter, and in some ways more devastating. He kept the conversation going, not because he was playing a game back. He was genuinely trying to understand what was happening, and he needed to be sure before he said anything. So he responded to Nadia's messages with the same measured, honest warmth he brought to most things. And he watched how the conversation evolved. She pushed a little further each time. Testing, he now understood, was exactly the right word for it. After about 10 days, he had what he needed. Not anything explicit, but a clear, documented pattern of a woman who was reaching for something she believed he might give, and had been designed, he was almost certain, to do exactly that. He screenshot the entire exchange. Every message, from the first comment about Otis to the latest, where Nadia had written, "I feel like if we'd met in a different life, things might have been really different for both of us." He sat with it for a day. He went to work. He came home. He made dinner. Claire talked about her week, and he listened, and he realized, genuinely calm. Not the performed calm of someone suppressing rage, the actual calm of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and has made peace with it. That evening, after dinner, he said, "I want to show you something." He handed her his phone. He said nothing else. Claire's face changed as she scrolled. He watched it, not triumphantly, not with satisfaction, but with the steady attention of someone trying to understand. He saw the color shift in her expression. He saw the moment she recognized what she was looking at. He saw the moment she understood he had known. She set the phone down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "I was trying to know if I could trust you." "I know," he said. "Things have felt, I don't know, off for a while. And I needed to, Claire." His voice wasn't sharp, but it was clear. "That's not how you find out if someone loves you." She looked at him. There were things moving across her face: embarrassment, defensiveness, and underneath both of those, something that looked like grief. He picked up the phone. He looked at her, and he asked the question he had been carrying all day, the one that had been sitting at the center of everything. "If you trust me so little, why are we married?" The question didn't land like a weapon. It landed like a door, opening onto a room they'd both been afraid to enter. She didn't answer. Not that night. Brian moved into the guest room that same night. Not dramatically. He simply said he needed space to think, gathered a few things, and closed the door. He was not cruel. He was not absent. He continued to live in the apartment, continued to feed Otis, continued to be civil and even warm in the ways that 6 years of habit demand. But something essential had shifted, and they both felt it. The apartment, which had always been quiet, became a different kind of quiet. The kind that has weight. Claire went through several phases in the months that followed, and Brian was close enough to observe them even as he kept his distance. The first phase was justification. She told herself, and eventually, Brian suspected, told Diane, that what she'd done wasn't that serious, that people in long relationships check sometimes. That doubt isn't the same as accusation. She believed this in the way we believe things that protect us from the harder truth. She reached out to Diane less than Brian might have expected. That surprised him. When he noticed it, he came to understand, slowly, that Claire was perhaps beginning to see that Diane's involvement had been something other than friendship, that Diane had agreed too readily, had perhaps even enjoyed it in some way Claire hadn't anticipated. The friendship cooled. Claire didn't say so directly, but Diane's name stopped appearing in conversation, and that said everything. The second phase was more fragile. Claire began, haltingly, to look backward. Brian heard her on the phone with her sister one evening. Not eavesdropping, simply passing through, saying something about how she hadn't been fair. He didn't pause. He kept walking, but he held that sentence for a long time afterward. He, meanwhile, was doing his own quiet work. He had started seeing a therapist, not because he was falling apart, but because the question he'd asked Claire had turned around and started asking him things too. Why hadn't he pushed all those months when he sensed her pulling away? Why had he let comfort become complacency? What had he been assuming about her without asking? He didn't arrive at comfortable answers. He arrived at honest ones, which was harder and more useful. One evening, about 3 months after the guest room became his room, Claire knocked on the door. She asked if they could talk. He said yes. They sat on opposite ends of the small couch, Otis between them like a gray mediator. And she said she was sorry. She said it plainly. Not with dramatic weight, just with the exhausted, careful honesty of someone who had finally stopped rehearsing. He listened. He didn't fill the silence that followed with reassurance because he wasn't ready to offer what reassurance would imply. But he nodded. And that, for now, was enough. The question of what came next remained open. Neither of them pretended otherwise. It was a Saturday in early winter, several months later, when they finally had the conversation that mattered. They had continued to exist in the same space. Two people navigating a shared life that had not officially ended, but had not yet found its new shape. They had been to 2 sessions of couples counseling, gone separately to their own therapists, and had arrived, gradually, at a way of speaking to each other that was more careful and more honest than what they'd had before, which was both an improvement and a kind of quiet grief in itself. The ease they'd once had was gone. What replaced it required effort. That effort was real. It just wasn't the same. On that Saturday, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Otis was asleep in the rectangle of pale winter light that fell across the floor. Claire wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "I think I was afraid." Brian waited. Not of you specifically. Of not knowing. Of assuming everything was fine and then finding out it wasn't. So I made it happen on my terms, I think. Without realizing that's what I was doing. Brian looked at his coffee. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about that, about how I made it easy for you to doubt. Not by doing anything wrong, but by making myself so predictable that I became invisible to you. I thought that was safety. I think you felt it as absence." She looked at him. Something in her eyes was painful and clear at the same time. "We were both somewhere else," she said. Yes, the silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It wasn't cold. It wasn't loaded. It was just two people sitting with something true. He looked at her and said gently, "I don't think I can go back to how it was. I'm not sure I'd want to. That version of us didn't work." "No," she agreed, "it didn't. But I don't know yet if what's here, what we're doing now, is the beginning of something or the end of something. I think I need more time to know that." She nodded. She didn't rush to fill the space with hope she wasn't certain of. That restraint, he noticed, was new. It was one of the things that had changed in her. He didn't know yet if it was enough. He wasn't sure she knew either. What he did know was this: the marriage they'd had was over. That version of themselves, the comfortable, half-present, mutually assumed version, was done. Whether something else could be built in its place was still an open question, and for the first time in months, the openness of that question didn't feel like danger. It felt like honesty, which was, perhaps, where they should have started. Brian reached across the table, not to hold her hand, just to rest his briefly beside hers. She looked down at it, then up at him, and she gave a small nod, the kind that doesn't mean agreement, but acknowledgement. "I see you. I'm here. I don't know yet either." Otis stretched in the winter light and went back to sleep. Outside, the city carried on. And inside the apartment that had held 6 years of their life, the breakfasts and the late nights and the comfortable silences and the painful ones, two people sat quietly with the uncertain, necessary weight of what they had finally, honestly said to each other. Some stories don't end with answers. Some end with the courage to stop pretending you have them. And sometimes that is the most important ending of all.